The world only saw the cute face of a young prince behind the castle gates for years. There was a strange quiet. Servants whispered. In the middle of the night, Nanny left. And now, a palace psychologist broke the royal fantasy only a minute ago, exposing something so terrible that it could completely alter the course of the monarchy. What has been concealed from view? Why now too? Before we get deeper into what this truly means for the royal family, please sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. On the surface, Prince Louis was the epitome of a young man waving from a balcony. Playfully tugging at his mother's dress, he smiled at the cameras. However, something darker was simmering inside the royal walls, while the populace was enamored with his antics. Courtiers discussed strange outbursts and whispers. Employees who worked closely with Louis started to leave in private, giving personal reasons. But their faces behind closed doors revealed that they were frightened, uneasy, and afraid to talk. According to a former royal nanny who wished to remain anonymous, Louis would weep for hours on end on certain nights, and no consolation could stop him. She answered in a trembling voice that he wasn't having tantrums. It was similar. He was absorbed in his thoughts. At the time, her remarks were disregarded, buried under layers of denial and formality. She wasn't alone, though. Insiders started pointing out that Louis frequently and inexplicably missed important royal engagements. Louis's involvement in occasions was unpredictable, in contrast to George or Charlotte, whose attendance was well orchestrated and polished. He would be late, or not at all. When he did show there, handlers were uncharacteristically near, talking incessantly and distracting, changing course. What precisely were they concealing? Behavioral specialists have become fixated on footage from recent events, particularly the Jubilee. They've started examining each blink and each faint flinch. Just one remarkable detail: Louis's total emotional disengagement amid thunderous cheers, followed by abrupt, startling laughing that looked to practiced. According to one expert, this is not usual child behavior. It implies either emotional overstimulation or perhaps both. The media's silence was even more unsettling. Televised broadcasts stopped reporting Louis's actions. Inexplicably, paparazzi images, typically brutal in their hunt for royal children, were not released. A number of reporters now attest that palace liaisons strongly advised them not to write anything that would have misrepresented Louis's emotional state. A gag order, clad in terms of public relations. According to reports, the royal family sought the help of an independent specialist behind the scenes who could work without being watched by the media. Here comes Dr. K, a psychologist who has a reputation for working with high-profile child issues in extremely discreet settings. She never intended for her role to be made public. Under the pretense of being an educational consultant, she was subtly introduced. Her true purpose, however, was much more important. Dr. K observed Louis for weeks, not just his behavior in public, but also his private life, habits, anxieties, and relationships with family. Insiders say she was shaken by what she discovered. Louis was obviously unprotected by a system that prioritized image over intervention, not because he was ill. The palace believed that her presence would bring about a calm resolution. The purpose of a Dr. K was not to keep illusions alive. Her purpose was to be honest. However, the diagnosis was just the start. Nobody could have predicted how much more terrifying what transpired inside the royal home would be. Each smile concealed a more profound tale. Each wave was practiced, and the reality? It was concealed in full view. Experts in body language now think that the indicators, which included fidgeting hands and vacant gaze, were always present. Did the palace already know, or why didn't they take action sooner? Prince Louis's presence was carefully planned from the moment he entered the spotlight. At Wimbledon, Louis was frequently observed wriggling, hiding his ears, or gazing into space, while George and Charlotte clapped courteously and obeyed instructions. The youngest royal was observed making crazy gestures, sticking out his tongue, or turning away from the audience at the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. It was dismissed by the public as childish mischief. However, something was obviously falling apart underneath the laughing. Observers now feel that these were silent pleas for assistance rather than indications of misconduct. Louis appeared to float in and out of the scene, in contrast to his siblings. Louis was frequently either eerily still or hyper-animated during the balcony presentations, where Charlotte curtsied gracefully and George stood erect. It was a stark contrast. George seemed intent, hoist Charlotte. Louis, though, he was not connected, far away, lost in a universe that few others seemed to comprehend. Later, palace sources acknowledged that there had been persistent worries about Louis's responses to abrupt bursts of light, erratic crowds, and loud noises. Although aides privately reported him as exhausted and at times absolutely frozen during rehearsals, the public witnessed him display odd faces. There have been rumors of meltdowns before events, and that Louis would only consent to go provided certain comfort measures were taken. The outside world was never supposed to see these moments. They nearly did, though. Unsettling backstage conversations between royal aides were repeatedly captured on hot mic recordings. "Just keep him smiling," a tech heard a handler say during one engagement. "Remove him from the stage if he continues to gaze." One more whispered, "This cannot continue. It is unfair to him." These comments were never broadcast. They cut the feeds. The video vanished. However, the tension, it was becoming worse. Even the royal press staff was starting to feel concerned by this point. Between those committed to uphold the monarchy's reputation and those who were desperate to keep the boy safe, a silent revolt was growing. Reporters started to put more pressure on them. "This is not your issue, he's fine," one was allegedly informed. But they knew in their hearts Louis wasn't doing well. The act was also getting old. Medical assistants were also becoming irritated. They advocated for longer intervals between events, fewer public appearances, and greater accommodations. However, an organization that was desperate to maintain continuity and strength at all costs drowned out their voices. "The firm doesn't know how to deal with vulnerability," one assistant said, "especially not with a crown on." According to experts, the royal managers used deceptive tactics to try to control Louis in real time while he was making public appearances. He tapped his shoulder, in his ear, whispering, directing a wave with his hands. These nudges weren't mild. These acts were designed to cover up an escalating problem, but there was still no sound in the palace. Unaware, the world watched. And Louis, imprisoned in a golden cage, kept on performing. And one voice broke the decorum just when everyone assumed the palace would step in softly. She was the last chance for the palace. She is now its most dangerous whistleblower, though. The psychologist employed to guard the youngest prince of the monarchy, Dr. K, took a startling turn and did the unimaginable. She went public. Her remarks were devastating as well as clinical, revealing a system based on emotional neglect, denial, and secrecy. Dr. K wasn't your typical advisor. She had worked with some of the most complicated childhood trauma cases in well-known families worldwide for more than 20 years. When rumors regarding Prince Louis could no longer be disregarded, she was the ideal candidate because of her reputation for secrecy, veracity, and aggressive advocacy. She entered the palace as a lifeline, rather than a critic. With a stringent secrecy agreement and royal-level security clearance. The purpose of her meetings with Louis was to do quick, standard evaluations that would allay her inner fears. However, what started off as ordinary observation swiftly turned into something more sinister. Leaked sources close to the psychologist claimed that Louis' speech was not that of a carefree child. He talked softly, like if he were drowning. "Why do I have to smile when I'm scared?" he even reportedly asked during one session. A question that deeply unsettled Dr. K. He talked of feeling confined to noisy spaces and being perplexed as to why he was required to appear in front of cameras, unsure of the difference between performance and reality. "They only see me when I'm happy," he reportedly said, expressing a sense of invisibility. These were not outbursts. These were early indicators that a child was experiencing emotional difficulties, but instead of supporting him, the organization pushed for things to return to normal. Dr. K begged senior palace officials to limit Lewis's public exposure because she was worried about the seriousness of what she was seeing. She maintained that instead of more picture opportunities, rehearsals, or briefings, the boy needed expert clinical help. However, she encountered deflection each time she sounded the alert. The family informed her they couldn't afford to speculate, and that a united, joyful front must be presented to the public. Weeks went by. The sessions became more intense. Once vivacious and intermittent, Louis' demeanor began to exhibit phases of quiet and outward retreat. He averted his gaze. "I want to go somewhere peaceful, but there's always a camera," he reportedly murmured during one session. Dr. K made the choice at that point. She was no longer able to be complicit. She quietly and quickly resigned. Or so the palace believed. Her final internal report was leaked within hours, not to competing royals or tabloids, but to a global network of kid mental health professionals, which recognized it right away as a demand for institutional responsibility. The report described a pattern of systemic incompetence, emotional mishandling, and an unsettling preference for appearance over a child's well. The purpose of Dr. K's leak was protection, not retaliation, but it broke the carefully cultivated illusion of the palace. A royal scandal that had nothing to do with affairs or money occurred for the first time in decades. Something much more damaging was at stake. The inner anguish of a youngster who has been muted by obligation. However, what was stated in that report? And why is the palace currently under complete lockdown? Although the report's language was clinical, the crushing weight it carried was not. The media's favorite cheeky royal, Prince Louis, was suffering from an illness that may alter everything, not for him alone, but for the whole succession. Even seasoned experts were taken aback by the news that was concealed deep within Dr. K's leaked study. Unnamed for privacy reasons, this rare neurological emotional illness has serious implications. The study states that Louis displayed recurrent patterns of social disengagement, increased susceptibility to stimuli, and unexpectedly strong emotional reactions. The royal world was the most demanding stage of all, and to put it simply, he was having difficulty processing the environment around him. Despite not being categorized as a handicap, the condition was defined as developmentally unusual. In controlled environments, Louis was expressive and intellectually acute. However, when he was under stress, particularly the performative demands of royal life, his reactions became erratic. One minute he might be composed, the next he might lose it. The flare of a camera flash or a simple cheer from the audience could cause an emotional overload or a silent shutdown. The findings were clear-cut. Every time he was forced into the spotlight, the high-functioning prince was under tremendous psychological strain. Dr. K took her assessment seriously. She described her approach in detail, pointing out that although Louis had exceptional resilience, his neurological profile needed regulated situations and sustained emotional care. The fundamental framework of royal life, its practices, appearances, and expectations, was directly at odds with his need for security. According to the report, public performance serves as an accelerant, causing his symptoms to worsen quickly. One statement, buried on page 14, ab specie, was possibly the most damning of them. It now reverberates like a premonition through royal halls, left unattended. An identity crisis with constitutional ramifications could result from this. It wasn't merely a caution. It was a warning sign directed at a centuries-old establishment that was fixated on tradition, poise, and the appearance of perfection. For this was more than just a kid battling in quiet. It concerned the possible disintegration of a king's function in the future. In addition to blood, the line of succession is based on perceived stability and strength. What happens if the youngest heir, who was previously endearingly erratic, turns out to be silently disintegrating? When one of its own no longer fits the pattern yet isn't let to escape, how can a monarchy adjust? This was an opportunity to show empathy, for openness, for the monarchy to take the initiative and exercise honest leadership. However, they didn't take that route. However, the palace opted for power over empathy, launching a reaction that is even more terrifying than the diagnosis. Despite the fact that the diagnosis was confidential, the palace's response was everything but. A deliberate attempt to alter Prince Louis's reality is suggested by leaked emails, media blackouts, and meticulously staged images. The royals were already rewriting the story with brutal accuracy as Dr. K's report circulated behind closed doors. The report was leaked, and Kensington Palace went into overdrive within hours. The plan was obvious. Cover the reality with carefully chosen grins. Louis appeared all of a sudden, laughing in unscripted, informal photos and smiling in the gardens with his siblings, taking family walks while holding hands with Catherine. However, these were not impromptu situations. Each and every picture was faked. Entire scenes were arranged with press photographers under non-disclosure agreements, according to many sources. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was choreography for a crisis. Tabloid sources started speculating about a blackout pact behind the scenes. According to reports, palace officials called major media outlets and asked them to tone down their coverage. It has been reported that editors were promised early access to royal scoops in return for keeping quiet about Louis's illness. In a matter of days, the internet was overrun with fluff rather than worry. The funniest faces of Prince Louis. The royal miscreant is back. Headlines intended to break the tension, detract, make the truth vanish. Not everyone in the machine, however, remained quiet. Former aides started talking, firmly but off record. One said that any time Louis seemed uneasy during events, they were told to set up opportunities to plan amusing diversions. Another described how any media organization that dared to inquire as to why Louis had been absent from several trips was denied access. Once a media favorite, the sign was now strictly regulated. A narrative strength. Nevertheless, the fissures deepened in the shadow of this manipulation. Something darker was alluded to in inside documents. To prevent optical discrepancies, rather than for Louis's health, he was being pulled from a number of upcoming royal engagements. The palace just decided to conceal him rather than face the emotional cost. An absent strategy. A kid was cut out of the picture. Prince William and the palace advisors in charge of image management became tense. According to sources, he advocated for openness and for putting Louis's mental health ahead of public opinion. But he encountered opposition. The impression of weakness was too costly for the monarchy, particularly not right now, not when the appearance of togetherness was the foundation for so much of the future. Behind Kensington's walls, a secret conflict was raging between those who were determined to defend the monarchy and those who wished to safeguard a son. One voice would eventually break through the commotion as photographers scouted the castle windows for the cameras. One figure, however, defied authority by sending a message that would shatter the royal destinies, while the grown-ups planned how to limit the damage. No news release, no interview on television, a handwritten letter, delivered in silence, never intended to be seen. However, what Catherine said to a close confidant has now been made public. In addition, they show a mother who is at war with her own palace as well as the world. The letter was never meant to be read by the general public. It was given to a longtime friend from Catherine's time at university, someone who is not a member of the elite. However, the letter ended itself in the hands of the press, as the pressure on Louis increased, and the palace's silence evolved into calculated denial. It revealed revolt, rather than just heartache. Catherine revealed in her own handwriting what the world had feared but could never confirm. She had been fighting alone for her kid. She wrote of her guilt and how royal expectations were immobilizing her despite her awareness that something was amiss. She described how Louis would cling to her, trembling and overwhelmed, before being thrust into the spotlight. And there was a mother in those remarks, troubled by the idea that she hadn't done enough to protect him. Her voice changed from sadness to rage. She recounted how her concerns were dismissed at royal meetings, where she was informed that Louis will either need more structure or grow out of it. Behind closed doors, she said, emotion was an annoyance, and compassion was seen as weakness. Nights spent sobbing next to Louis's bed were detailed in her letter, whispering vows she was afraid she wouldn't be able to fulfill. She added, "I'm not sure he believed me when I told him it's okay to feel scared." In the middle of the letter was one of the most shocking admissions. Catherine acknowledged that she had once given giving up the royal life some serious thought. Not due to the media, not due to controversy, but because she believed that she couldn't be a mother and a princess at the same time, especially in a society that expected perfection from a child who was already having difficulty breathing. She also revealed that she and William were becoming more at odds. She implied that he felt trapped between his responsibilities as a father and his duty to the crown while he stood by her in private. She wrote that their disagreements were about priorities rather than love. He wants to keep Louis safe, she wrote. However, he fears the consequences for the monarchy. However, her letter's last sentence pierced the palace's pristine exterior like a dagger. He isn't a representation, he is my son. It was a proclamation, a caution, and a tacit denial that Louis should be sacrificed for the sake of custom. This letter's leak was uncontrollable. It struck a chord in moms' hearts all throughout the world, far beyond the tabloids. The people started to doubt the palace's very principles in addition to its silence. When a monarchy forces those who are suffering to keep quiet, what is the price? However, just as Catherine started advocating for reform, a different queen emerged with a completely different goal. Camilla calculated while Catherine cried. According to people close to the queen consort, she viewed Louis's diagnosis as an opportunity rather than a disaster, a chance to change the succession of the monarchy and establish authority where it was most needed. The palace was rocked by the disclosure of Dr. K's findings. One person, though, remained unflinching throughout the chaos. Within hours of the report reaching senior royals, Camilla, who was experienced in scandal and adept at surviving, reportedly started having secret chats. Even though she didn't say it out, her message was clear. There had to be tough choices made if Louis was now a threat to the stability of the company. It is reported that Camilla asked Charles uncomfortable questions behind closed doors. No one else ventured to ask those questions out loud. Louis, was he fit to serve? Was it time to reconsider the succession plan? The crown, she believed, could not afford emotional instability, not when everyone was so intent on observing the next generation. She suggested a contentious change of direction that would give Princess Charlotte, who is frequently commended for her poise and presence, a larger future role. That was no idle proposal. It was strategic. Insiders claim that Camilla set up a covert meeting with top advisors. Why? To covertly investigate a long-term strategy for removing Louis from publicly visible royal responsibilities, what one source terrifyingly referred to as a soft removal. No announcements to the public, no shame, just a silent shift in concentration. Elegant erasure disguised as protection, fewer appearances, and waning relevance. However, not everybody was prepared to comply. William was furious when he learned of the meeting. William and Camilla's altercation was the most tense moment in years, according to a source close to the royal household. According to reports, he accused her of weakening the family in the name of duty and using his son's suffering for political advantage. The staff have ears, and they haven't stopped talking since, even though the walls don't. Given Camilla's long-standing reputation as a backstage operator, this is all the more pernicious. Never be overt. Always accurate. Some people think that this is more about establishing power, while Charles is still king, than it is about Charlotte at all. In addition to limiting uncertainty, Camilla gradually reshapes the monarchy's future into a controllable image by diminishing Louis's role. She sees clearly a simplified, refined, and uncomplicated monarchy. And if that means ignoring a struggling youngster, then so be it. After all, in royal circles, sympathy has never been a survival tactic. Her schemes, however, could have gone too far this time. Because Prince Louis's story is no longer confined to murmurs inside the castle. Everywhere throughout the monarchy, the winds are screaming like a storm. The Queen's shadow hovered over all of her hidden desires for Louis as the family fell apart, just now becoming apparent. Queen Elizabeth left behind a number of private memos long before she died. One page, handwritten, sealed, and addressed to Louis, was among them. Nobody knew what was inside. Up until now, even her closest advisors would have been in astonished silence at what the Queen had predicted. It was turmoil, not formality, that led to the discovery. One envelope caught the attention of legal teams searching through the late Queen's estate, collecting papers and private letters. It only had a grandmother's feeble script on it, no official seal or crest. Parliament was not the intended recipient. Charles wasn't even the intended recipient. Louis was the intended recipient. The letter is described as shocking by those who read it, for how well it foretold the storm that now encircled her great-grandson, not for what it disclosed about the present. Elizabeth voiced her growing worry for the burden of royal responsibility on future generations in her distinctive tone, which was forceful but caring. She talked about how the world was changing too quickly, of standards that were no longer appropriate for the souls they were imposed upon, and she identified Louis as the person who may be most affected by that conflict, not George or Charlotte. She described him as a toddler, perceptive, reserved, wary of crowds, and afraid that the customs that had previously molded her rule might one day break his spirit. Some people are born to rule, she said, to remind the crown of its humanity. Others are born. Tucked away near the bottom of the page, that one line now reverberates like a prophecy. The Queen, however, didn't stop with feeling. She made a request that rocked the protocol's basis. She proposed the establishment of a new system of assistance for non-heir royals, one that would enable people like Louis to live out of the spotlight without shame or scandal. The concept was groundbreaking. It was buried almost instantly under the cozy words of grandmotherly writing. After reading the document, Charles supposedly decided it was too unstable to put into effect. He ordered the page to be sealed, filed, and never discussed again, according to insiders. He believed that the monarchy could never afford to admit the fact that not all royals were suitable for the position, at least not in public. However, the letter reappeared in some way, and everything changed when it got into Catherine's hands. She read it by herself, closely clutched, and didn't try to conceal what it meant to her. For Catherine, this was a requirement rather than merely a wish, evidence that Louis's battle was real, that even the Queen had anticipated it, that in her last days, the most resilient monarch of the modern period had opted for empathy over legacy. In Kensington, the memo is now kept in a locked drawer. However, its statements have started to influence decisions in the background. For how long can the palace act as though it knows better if the Queen's last desire was to relieve Louis of the responsibilities of his position? The destiny of the kingdom, however, may suddenly depend on a child, and the choice that no one wants to make as tensions increase and secrets are revealed. What happens if a prince is unable to lead a princely life? When expectations turn into chains rather than legacies and titles hurt more than they elevate, a reckoning is imminent as the castle clings to delusion. Standing in the middle of a storm he did not choose is Prince Louis. However, what follows could permanently alter the monarchy. Quiet talks have already started inside royal chambers. No press conferences, no formal regulations. Only rumors, apprehensive, calculated rumors of a possible reorganization of responsibilities for the younger royals. The system, heirs and spares, public and private, duty and sacrifice, has remained inflexible for decades. However, Louis is driving a fresh query into the very heart of the monarchy. What happens if the crown is too small? According to sources, Catherine and a few other senior aides are pushing for a legal framework that would enable Louis to leave public duties before they overwhelm him. Not a scandal, no banishment, only room, defense, a future shaped by love, not by convention. Now, the driving force behind this silent revolution is Catherine, who was empowered by the Queen's secret missive. She is not pleading for pity. She is requesting a different model, but in royal life, as usual, legacy complicates love. William. He was once thought to be the link between the old and the modern, but now he is stuck in the middle. He is a father, on the one hand, and he hears his son's quiet more clearly than any royal pyrotechnic. However, he is pledged to preserve the very institution that is causing his family to fall apart, making him the future king. According to those close to him, the strain is apparent. Nights without sleep. Meetings were canceled. Emotional detachment. He's crumbling. The palace is aware of this. Then the words, the ones no one expected, appeared, allegedly said in a private counseling session. Later, someone inside the tight circle undoubtedly shared it, albeit anonymously. "Will anyone still clap if I disappear?" Louis reportedly whispered. Not a fit. It's not a game for kids. An appeal. A devastating look inside the thoughts of a boy who has already started to associate performance with love. Purposeful presence. Worthy applause. That sentence's disclosure did something the palace couldn't have predicted. It completely upended the public narrative. Throughout the night, pity grew. Social media shifted from jeering to lamenting. For days, hashtags calling for Louis's release became viral. Journalists who used to support the image are now challenging it. And the boy behind the title started to resemble their own children to parents all across the world. Despite its long history, the monarchy must now make a decision it has never had to make so openly. Either embrace humanity or preserve the myth, because it won't be rebellion if Prince Louis leaves the royal life. The reason for this will be survival. And that might be the most revolutionary act of all, more than any scandal or abdication. The palace is still divided, according to insiders. Louis's departure, according to others, would create a risky precedent. Some contend that it might be the exact overhaul the organization requires. However, the indisputable truth lies underlying all opinions. The purpose of Louis was never to serve as a symbol. He never begged to feed the machine he was born into. The machine is now being forced to gaze inward for the first time. Everything changed in a single minute. Now, the entire world is watching, breathless and saddened, to see what the palace will do next. Thanks for viewing. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.